Hey everyone, and welcome to this Module 11 lecture. We'll try to keep it short today as we've all got a lot going on, but just definitely wanted to hit on some of the readings from the Baresh text for this week. Excuse me. So we've moved on from our considerations of the difference between positive and negatively imagined peace. Now we're sort of moving into some of the strategic questions to do with whether or not there are optimal ways to pursue that peace. And I don't know that you will feel the same way as me, but certainly I feel that the more philosophical questions were last week. It seems to me that this question of what we do with the world once we have the peace conveyed to us that there were very divergent viewpoints indeed on what the good life looks like. And this week I feel that those questions have been suspended as we move into consideration of some fairly almost dogmatic, I would say, even views. Certainly with reading Tolstoy, his very sort of one-way approach to understanding the way to practice peace seemed to be kind of almost singularly impressive in their dogmatism, you know? So certainly there's a critique inherent in a lot of what these scholars are saying, and one of the themes that I think comes to me from looking at their arguments is the idea that violence is not just a phenomena that happens at the top level of society. It is a phenomena that happens throughout society. And this echoes to me the remarks of Hannah Arendt, who was famously, and I know I've talked about this example with some of you before, Hannah Arendt, of course, was famous for having suggested that evil at the end of the day is banal, right? So she had gone to the Adolf Eichmann trial in Israel and had been impressed by the realization that she had watching this trial that Eichmann was not really all that evil to look at. You know, he did not do us the convenient favor of having little red horns growing out of his head. He was a Nazi logistician. He was very effective at what he did. He was one of the people who centrally organized the Holocaust. But in terms of what he did for his day-to-day job, it seems that Arendt was impressed by the fact that many of the things that he was doing seemed very ordinary. He lived a sort of a relatively ordinary everyday life, or at least in the sense that he would get up in the morning, you know, clean his teeth, have breakfast, go to work, and look at train timetables all day long. That seemed to be sort of an impression to Arendt that there was a rather peculiar and ordinary nature, or everyday nature, to the kind of evil that was being perpetrated by the Nazis in some respects. So what do we take from that? One person who had a great sort of impact from this story of Arendt's was Stanley Milgram. Stanley Milgram, as you may know, I've talked about it in some of my other classes, but Milgram, of course, set up the famous experiments where he invited people in off the street in Berkeley to help him apply electric shocks to people to whom he was asking questions for in a controlled study. And of course, it was a setup, right? The people who were hooked up to the electricity weren't in fact hooked up, and they were actors. But the people coming in off the street didn't know that. And so the true subjects of the experiment were not the people in the room hooked up to the electricity, but were the people in off the street. And the question was, how far would they go in order to please or give satisfaction to those who are in authority over them? And so the question here was about obedience. And Milgram was impressed, you know, because a lot of people had said that maybe just the Japanese, the Germans are authoritarian personalities. But in fact, what he found out was that pretty much everyone is authoritarian. If you have someone in charge who looks like they're wearing a white coat and who has symbols of authority about their person, most all of us will do what they say unquestioningly. And what the pieces this week seem to be suggesting, to me anyway, is that it's very important to ask questions. It's very important to understand that the complicity in violence is often a very everyday, ordinary phenomena. It can be as simple as paying your taxes and not asking the question as to what your taxes contribute to. Um, or it can be to do even with something much more absolutist. From, as we'll see from Tolstoy's perspective, any form of violence at all really is to be prohibited, and there are no exceptions whatsoever. So let's take some time to go through these questions about culture. About the way in which ordinary violence, if you want to put it in those terms, is not so ordinary at all once you look at it from the perspective of the scholars that we have to read this week. So, we talk about Thoreau first. I think this is the more interesting of the two pieces that we have to look at, because Thoreau, I think, was very much taken with the idea that the nation state itself has a kind of politics all of its own. You know, many of us get obsessed with the idea of this state or that particular state having good or bad intentions. You know, we try to separate or distinguish between good states and bad states. Well, from Thoreau's perspective, the state itself is a problem, right? It is a problem because it has government, and government is a phenomena, a sociological phenomena, if you will, that exists just as much in our heads as it does in real life. Or rather, if you excuse me, he seems to be suggesting that maybe the state or government doesn't exist in real life, that it only exists in our heads, but that its reality comes from its apparent reality comes from the fact that it exists in our heads. So if you guys have taken my international relations class, you'll know that sometimes we talk about constructivism, and constructivist theory suggests exactly kind of what we're suggesting here, that, you know, if a large enough number of people share an idea, that idea becomes real for them because they all act as if it is real. So Thoreau is making this argument. It's very constructivist, or perhaps if you remember us ever talking about Foucault before, it's very Foucauldian. The state isn't really real. It's not really there. It's made up of men, and so it's really nothing more than a reflection of what men are thinking, what their shared thoughts are, and what they're doing. If they're acting in correspondence, if their actions are corresponding to the existence of that state, then the state ipso facto exists, or the idea of the state rather, then the state exists. So what does this mean for our analysis of civil disobedience? Well, if government is there really just because we sort of believe it's there, then really it's nothing more than a social phenomena. He uses the term that it's an expedient. It's really just something that's there because we want it to be there. It doesn't have to be there. And so for that reason, he says that there's no real reason why we shouldn't question it more regularly or more frequently. And of course, in his time, he believed that this need to question the state was a very real and urgent one, because at the time of writing, the Mexican-American War was brewing, and he was singularly opposed to this idea of this war because he saw it as a U.S. provocation that was basically to do with the interests of people in the southern states, to create attention and misdirect attention away from the question of slavery. But I think certainly I'm not sure if about too much about the history of that particular conflict, but I do know that the U.S. forces were sent up very, very close to the border, and eventually there was an event called the Thornton Affair, which resulted in the Mexican army attacking and killing, I think, 15 U.S. soldiers. And as a result of that, conflict did ensue for 2 years. Um, and for people like Thoreau, the way in which the Mexicans were sort of forced into this conflict by U.S. provocation really led him to be dubious about the overall virtue of American government, or any government really for that matter. There's a touch of Mark Twain in this, of course, isn't there? There's love your country always, love your government when it deserves it. And I think perhaps there's a bit of that in Thoreau's argument. So what is government then? Government is, he says, a complicated machinery. It's a corporation. It's a corporate body, which means that it's a collective body, and it has a conscience. But what sort of conscience? Is it a good conscience or a bad conscience? Well, as he says, without conscientious men, no corporation has a conscience that's worth speaking of. So this mentality, or this shared mindset that we've been alluding to, can be one of responsibility. We can do good for the state, but it is going to require judgment and rectitude on our part. So he continues with this machinic metaphor later in the piece, where he says all machines have their friction, but responsible men, good men, will realize that their lives can be a counter-friction to stop the machine. So there's natural wear and tear in the machine, but you can also throw nuts and bolts into the machine and slow it down or wear it out. And that's what he sort of envisions as the purpose of conscientious men, that their job is to kind of get in the way, to put their bodies on the line, to practice ultimately, and this is the theme of the piece, civil disobedience. And of course this essay is a famous essay, and it's inspired a lot of people who have engaged in civil disobedience throughout U.S. history. So we need to think a little bit about some of the points that he's making here in terms of throwing ourselves into the machine, or using the bodies that we have to throw them into the machine to sort of shut the machine down, or make it slow down, or break it to a certain extent. The problem most people have is he says, is that they're not conscientious. They don't really think about the nation state as being an instrument that's there just because of the work of men. It's not a real thing. It's just an artificial thing that is man-made, the nation state. And so a lot of people, especially in the military, he says, are in awe of this phenomena. There's a bit of Durkheim in that argument. And as he says, because they are in awe, they will tend to instrumentalize themselves in the service of the state. They will make themselves as if they were just wood, earth, and stones at the service of the state. And they have no, he says, free exercise whatever of the judgment or of the moral sense that they would otherwise have, because they're so in awe. So they've no moral sense. They don't really question or challenge orders that they are given by the nation state. Men who serve as administrators do use their heads, he says, but they're not much better than the military in terms of this morality question. That's not to say that there aren't people who don't question the nation state, but there are many, those who do, oftentimes, if they are awake, so to speak, or if they are enlightened, then they may not feel that they have anything that they can do to change the nature of the situation they're confronted with. And Thoreau is a bit upset about people like this, right? Because he feels that it's pointless to see a political problem and do nothing about it, right? As he says, to object to a political problem and doing nothing is to sort of benefit from the situation you're in while sitting on another man's shoulders. He does believe you have to practice what you preach. There is such a thing, he says, as action from principle. And if you have the principle but not the action, then really you're not a very honorable individual. So you don't wait then, from Thoreau's perspective. You don't wait for the majority to catch up. You don't say, well, no one else believes what I believe, so there's not much point in doing anything. You have to act. The people around you may not like you for your civil disobedience. They may say that you're pursuing the worse, as he says, remedy. But he says, don't be afraid of that, because it's not your fault that you've been put in this situation, that you're upset, that you're angry, that the government is not keeping up its end of the bargain. Governments, he says, have always persecuted men of conscience. So don't wait for people just to sort of try to pursue slow change through the ballot box. He says voting is one thing, but voting with your whole vote is another. And of course, with this question of whole vote, the whole vote is the sense of putting your whole body on the line, right? As he talks then about the virtues of civil protests, he comes up with the idea that jail time is honorable. In fact, that there's a sort of honor in the refusal to pay taxes. What else would you want to be doing if you simply just exist with a wounded conscience and refuse to do anything about it? Then, in fact, you're kind of engaging in a kind of violence or bloodshed on your own self, and there's a violence there to be thought about. The violence of the bothered or troubled conscience that refuses to get up and do anything about it. So he is sort of calling to arms then those who would not get up off the couch and exercise their conscience. Now, he says, of course, naturally, many people at the end of the day will say, well, aren't you just being foolish? If no one else is really supporting you at this stage, why would you engage in politics alone, in a type of resistance politics on your own? Don't you think that that's sort of a little bit like putting your head in the fire? And he says, yes, maybe so, but at the end of the day, putting your head in the fire is a sort of a brute force phenomena that you could sort of anticipate the results, but you're never going to change the nature of the fire. But what you can do through your actions is change the nature of government. And because the state and the government is a man-made convention, you can actually hope that through your actions you could create long-term change. You may spend a lot of time in jail, you may put yourself on the line, but at the end of the day, that's all worth it. Because these things are changeable, as he says. Is democracy such as we know it the last improvement possible in government? Obviously the answer is no, and at the end of the day, all the state has is its superior physical strength to protect it. If hearts and minds change, then that superior physical strength is powerless to stand against the collective will of the people if they refuse to take part in and be complicit with this sort of everyday ordinariness of violence that the state is carrying out. And so I see a very strong connection there with Hannah Arendt, and I see a strong connection there with the Milgram experiments, because in a way this is Thoreau, many decades before World War II, already saying, we have choices in modern society. We can check our consciences and refuse to be part of things that we don't believe in. Now, Tolstoy, on the other hand, I think it's safe to say he has a sort of a more absolutist viewpoint, I think, than Thoreau. Tolstoy, of course, is a famous author and writer. He would maybe be known to you more in that capacity as a famous novelist. But on the other hand, he was also a Christian pacifist. He was an anarchist, and he was someone who took a very, very hard line and a spiritual line on the question of murder. As he says in his sort of quotation, fais ce que doit, advienne que pourra, which means do what's right, come what will. The fact is, God told us not to murder in the Bible, not to kill, not to steal, and we do this quite a lot, despite God's wishes, and he just does not see the sense in that. He says it's not in accordance with God's law, and it's certainly not in accordance with human reason, which he says is a very real phenomena, right? A decent person, not even a Christian, but even just a regular old decent person, will refuse to do certain things which are obviously cruel. And so the fact that we don't heed that obviousness is a big problem for him. So the complexity of the argument for Tolstoy, even though he seems to sort of repeat himself a little bit, is that there is a kind of a law that we can detect if we look at the teachings of Christ and we also look to our own reason. There is a kind of a law out there. It is similar, in fact, to what the Greeks called the golden mean, although, of course, Tolstoy doesn't mention this, but that is it in itself. It often said to be the turn the other cheek, the origin of the turn the other cheek mentality. So his point is to draw on this tradition, right? To say that there is a law of non-resistance that is a tradition, and while it itself cannot ever be literally a law, because that would be a self-contradictory, you cannot make it a law to enforce your will. You cannot enforce your will on people. He is an anarchist after all, so he doesn't believe in enforcing his own will on other people, but he does believe that this law of non-resistance is all to do with respecting the mandate from God's teachings not to carry out violence. So we don't make it a law of the land, but we create a kind of a norm or an ethic, if you will, whereby we do not engage in violence. To make that a law of the land would be to engage in violence, but there's another way. We don't have to make it a law of the land. We can just accept it all as the sort of natural law, in which case there's no law that we're responding to. It's our own internal sense of what's right and what's wrong. That's becoming each man governing himself as opposed to the state governing us and making us nonviolent. So because it is a personal choice then, and a personal choice that we follow in the name of redemption, we have a kind of a complex argument, as I was saying here. The sources that we are following, we're drawing on here, of course, are our natural reason, as our instinct, if you will, but also the Christian sensibility of the heart, he says. And those who follow this Christian sensibility, of course, may be subject to ire, to spite from those who are on the side of so-called law and order. But he says, don't be afraid of that. That's an age-old battle and strategy. Those who are in favor of law and order will always call those who are in favor of peace anarchists. And that is something that comes about in any war that you care to imagine, where every side thinks it's the more virtuous and always refers to the other side as the lawbreaker, or those who do not respect the law. As I was reading this piece, it occurred to me that as he began to talk about hypotheticals, and as he started to say that this Christian sensibility is right all the time, and hypotheticals notwithstanding, and he mentions, for example, the situation where we might be called upon to torture or abuse a child, a baby. And he says no right-thinking man, of course, would engage in such an act. And isn't this merely the extreme case, he's saying, by drawing our attention to that? He's trying to suggest that if we can think of an argument or a context wherein we would torture a baby, then that's kind of a slippery slope. You could imagine a whole series of arguments that would sort of stem from that. Well, it's okay to torture a child, a baby, in a certain type of situation, so therefore other types of torture and violence may also be permissible in other types of situations. And I think he's concerned that the slippery slope argument could be opened up there. Of course, in our own time, the war on terror has produced scenarios that call to mind this kind of argument, right? The so-called ticking time bomb scenario, which was invoked by many people, such as John Yoo, the lawyer of the Bush White House, who suggested in no uncertain terms that, and he suggested this in debates when he was asked in a debate, would he approve of the crushing of a person's child's testicles if it was a matter of national security. And John Yoo responded that yes, you could do that if the president felt that it was necessary in order to win the war on terror. And of course, many people responded to this with outrage because it is such an extreme example. But John Yoo was merely engaging in a type of thinking where you engage in a kind of a cost-benefit analysis. This is also the type of thinking, the cost-benefit analysis thinking of the ticking time bomb scenario is also the type of thinking that led to the waterboarding controversy, wherein, of course, we found that people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed were perhaps tortured over 100 times in order to extract information about events that were long since past. The crucial thing to keep in mind here is that Tolstoy attacks this notion of the ticking time bomb scenario. He doesn't obviously mention ticking time bomb scenario. He's using the example of torturing a baby, but he attacks this parallel example head on with a philosophy that is grounded in this idea that hypotheticals are always and everywhere just that. You can never really know whether the person will torture the baby or not. You can never really know that the person that you've detained is in fact the terrorist, is the right person, whether there's in fact a bomb, whether the person knows where the bomb is, whether the bomb will go off. There's all these what-if questions, and you're never, ever, ever going to be certain what the answer to those what-if questions are until the events actually have played themselves through. So Tolstoy, were he alive today, I think would in no uncertain terms object to the representation of the logic of torture, for example, in popular cultural products such as the TV show 24, where the hero, Jack Bauer, is often there just in time to prevent the ticking time bomb from going off, and has on occasion in the show stooped to use torture, and in so doing shores up this idea which we launched off with today, that there is a kind of a violence inherent, a culture of violence, if you will, inherent in the media sphere today. And it is through the media that, of course, we learn what's normal and what's not normal in our society. And people like Jack Bauer, being heroic figures, often give us pause to think that torture is justified sometimes. What Tolstoy would say is that, in fact, torture is a form of violence. It is proscribed by religious teaching, but also by reason's guidance. If one just listens to reason, one understands that hypotheticals are a very thin veneer style argument to cover up the abuse of power that is political violence. So interestingly, just a couple of side points about the piece from Tolstoy. I think it's interesting that he does allow one to consider putting one's body between the torturer and the child to try to protect the child. You can put your own body on the line. That's what civil disobedience is all about. But you cannot hurt the torturer. You cannot hurt the criminal or the person who's intending to kill the child, because that is a hypothetical. Similarly, insofar as you don't know that the person will actually torture the child or kill the child, and even if the person does torture or kill the child, maybe the life of the torturer is more important at the end of the day. Who is to say? It's hard to know what may come. The torturer may down the road turn out to be someone who makes a positive impact in people's lives some other way, experiences remorse, and perhaps becomes a person who's influential in the pursuit of peace after all. So, how are we to know from our hypothetical standpoint what may come? Isn't it better just to not get involved? Isn't it better just to not engage in violence? And Tolstoy sticks to his guns right through the rest of the piece. He says that leaders have a special function here insofar as they're often the ones who are in power, and people in power have often achieved their power, he says, through the profiting from violence. Or he says in direct quotes, they have profited by violence. And now it is, of course, in their interests to tell us that those who pursue peace are anarchists, that those who pursue peace are retrograde. But he says this is natural, and of course he's joining a theme here with the aforementioned Thoreau. And I think that idea that you're never going to have the majority standing with you if you're an advocate of peace is an interesting one here. So what should we do then with these leaders, with these people who have these charlatan views? We can call them hypocrites, and we can show through our actions that we have a much greater commitment to the teachings of the Bible than other leaders, than those leaders may have. So at the end of the day then, for Tolstoy, a truly reasonable, a truly peaceful life inheres in making the commitment to peace, to nonviolence. In an absolute sense, there's never a condition or situation where violence is acceptable. I don't think that Thoreau would agree with that, by the way, but Tolstoy certainly does. The benefit, of course, is that you'll be a much more satisfied Christian. You'll be truly alive. You'll be truly living in accordance with God's will, and you'll have a peace of mind that few people enjoy, because of course you'll have special knowledge of the fact that you are pleasing God, and you will likely go to heaven. So the pain and suffering of this life will be relatively meaningless to you compared to the greater benefits of a non-violent existence. So that's it for this week, folks. Here we will have class the next day we meet, and we will be continuing to read our supplementary texts there. Okay, so thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you in class. Take care.